Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Macho Man Real Estate channel. And here we are at part two of my presidential tier list, which was made in honor of George Washington's birthday, who is at S tier. And right around now, we left off with none other than Millard Fillmore in F tier, and we got someone who's definitely further lodged in F tier with President Franklin Pierce, who basically virtually just advocated for Southern apologist strategies with pathetic compromises. And these are compromises on slavery, of course. So Franklin Pierce, by George, he's mighty high up to being the worst president. I mean, obviously there's a certain other president who will be coming up, but Franklin Pierce is still easily one of the worst. Why, you may ask? Because of the fact that he was the one to implement popular sovereignty. Yep, that's right. He is the one who caused Bleeding Kansas and the whole Kansas and Nebraska Act, in which you had people, the citizens, choosing whether they would have slavery or not, instead of just instead of just eliminating the concept of having a slave state. I mean, granted, there were some pretty good anti-slavery advocates like John Brown that we had, but but in the end, it absolutely was not remotely worth it, though, to make it a choice, as that led to hundreds of American deaths, though. So he is very much greatly responsible for so he is indirectly responsible for various American casualties, though, at the helms of Bleeding Kansas and all the rebellions that happened for people who wanted slavery and people who didn't want slavery. And next up, we have none other than the Walt Disney of abysmal presidents, the worst of the worst, the negative power goat, James Buchanan. So, so this one is probably to the surprise of nobody. But one thing that may surprise you, though, is that he is actually, he wasn't as pro-slavery as some may think. But the problem, though, is that Buchanan was not the type to want to make enemies and was the worst person imaginable to handle a situation like this. Now, granted, I'm not saying he was a great person or that he wasn't due of any of those crimes. Though. He absolutely should have fought against slavery, but in the end, he was just someone who didn't want to get hated on, didn't want to get mocked out though. But he stood completely and utterly weak though in the face of justice, which is complete and truly just shows that he wasn't really the strongest character, unfortunately, and certainly was not fit for the office at one of the most difficult times in American history. So those actions, though, of not only just leaning towards the South, though, but even allowing the South to secede, is really once you finally went from kicking down that can to finally getting us into the Civil War and bringing in slavery. Now, finally, last but not now, of course, this one's very obvious as we gotta put President Abraham Lincoln in the S tier. Easy, easy, easy S tier. So, President Lincoln, though, what's there to say that's already not been said? You've got his incredible leadership during the Civil War, which obviously you got the bloodiest event the bloodiest set of years in American history, and you've also got the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and then later on the 15th Amendment, and trying to bring the country into Reconstruction. I will say I do have a few problems that probably do prevent him from being better than Washington, though. Not much better. So he wasn't completely devoid of racism, though, which isn't surprising because nobody is, but he did have some racist apart from from being a very anti-slavery character, he still did believe that other races such as African Native Americans, even African Americans, were inferior to whites. But thankfully, he did have some level of he did have the rationality to know that slavery was evil and fight vehemently against it. And of course, one of the other things, though, is that he did ban anything that was remotely pro-Confederate. Which, granted, the Confederates were some of the were extremely awful. I would say blatantly evil as well. But they don't really deserve that. But they're not nearly that But either way, though, that still is meddling with the First Amendment. So even if it is some of the worst people imagine, even if it is terrible people, though, and even worse, a terrible stance, it still is technically meddling with the First Amendment and leads to a bunch of unconstitutional and just in general unreasonable arrests. But frankly, though, his leadership during that time was phenomenal, and he didn't even want to try a lot of the people for treason. He truly wanted to heal the nation as a whole, which is an extremely noble cause, though. Although even with it, while he did try to heal them up, his attempts to make himself appear more moderate were pretty nasty by hiring President Andrew Johnson as his vice president and some other pro states rights Southerner types from the Democrat Party. But the great things about him, you've got literally passing the Emancipation Proclamation, which, while it didn't end all slavery, did end it in the southern states, which is a brilliant military strategy. On top of bringing in the great efforts of General Grant and William T. Sherman, though, for some magnificent military contributions on our behalf. And then again, if that wasn't enough, though, you got the literal 13th Amendment. That's right. The 13th Amendment prohibiting slavery on American soil. Not only that, but he's actually been considered to be the most aged president in office, though, which makes sense because being a president does genuinely age you. But you can actually see some photos, though, from when he was president and from when he became president and when he was at the end in office. And by George, is it some drastic whiplash to go from one image to the other. But in the end, President Lincoln, though, is truly a legend and arguably the GOAT of American presidency. There's good reason for such things. Now, however, we got someone who's right below the coattails of Buchanan with Andrew Johnson, who similarly was probably the biggest mistake of Lincoln, though, even more so than with the First Amendment, because this over here is just a bad way to compromise. It was just such a bad way to compromise, and it was from people who just shouldn't have been compromised with because they were genuine slavery advocates and advocates for general racism. However, with someone like President Johnson, he may have been a pro-slave. I mean, he was anti-slavery, though, but that was the only bout of justice. Most of the other plans, such as the 3 acres and a mule plan for the former slaves, were truly wretched, and he didn't have that same advisory from black figures that Lincoln did with Frederick Douglass, and for Lincoln's excellent military strategy to bring in black troops. Andrew Johnson just tried to prevent every piece of pro-racial integration, with the exception of abolishing slavery. And even at that, there were still other ways that they were able to get cheap and even unpaid labor out of African Americans. So it technically wasn't slavery in name, so it was basically slavery, but not in name by that point. And fun fact about Johnson was that he was actually the first president to face an impeachment trial, though, from the House, and by George, it was mighty close to him getting impeached, which would have been pretty awesome, I'll admit. However, if there's one thing I will say that I do like about him, is that he did try to fight elites as he was born into poorer backgrounds. So that is still pretty. I will give him credit in those regards, but that does not justify him in the slightest. Not at all. However, we got Grant, who I will say is a grotesquely underrated president. Granted, you got his later terms, which weren't as good because he had all that censorship and and some of the military over reliance. However, I'd say that he's a mighty fine example of how excellent the radical Republicans really were. I mean, Grant, you've got his biggest accomplishment, which was literally which was that act against the KKK, which had eliminated their threat as a terrorist organization for decades until its rise during the 1910s and 20s. He absolutely clobbered and liquidated it just decimated and ate them for Christmas dinner. It was beyond powerful. And I mean beyond powerful. And sadly, some people do see him as being more racist, though, oddly enough, and that he was just an angry drunkard from all the Southern myths. And people claim that he was a slave owner, which he did own a slave, but but he didn't buy the slave himself, though. That was given to a member from his family-in-law, though, who actually weren't as anti-slavery as him and his family were. And despite being in poor economic turmoil, he decided to free the slave, though, which is pretty noble if you ask me, that he decided to free that slave despite being in poor economic condition, and that he sacrificed a then financial asset for the greater moral cause. That's pretty noble. But and I could talk all day about the great things that he did. He brought a lot of black politicians to power, which we didn't really see a lot of, and he implemented the great sides of the Reconstruction era, though, which a lot of people do look back as a failure, but they were able to pass so much legislation with those radical Republicans, like Grant. It was truly, but in the end, I reckon I don't need to talk as much about him. I think we know him as a great general and also a great president. How over here we got pretty mediocre president with Rutherford B. Hayes, and the main thing that really was controversial with him was that he had the election against Samuel J. Tilden, who I'll say, was probably definitely among the better Democrats at the time, because this is back when the Democrats were all the racist and neo-Confederate slavery schmuckers, so that was quite awful. But he was definitely more moderate, and I don't really like his policy because he heavily reversed so many of the stances of the Reconstruction Act, and that's why the Reconstruction Act didn't become successful, though, despite all the incredible things it did. So I feel like by that point I gotta put him in D tier, though, high D tier. But the things that he did to the act, though, the fact that he really betrayed the cause of civil rights as a whole, is just sits very poorly with him. I gotta put him lower. Now, President Garfield, though, this may sound pretty surprising, but I consider him an A tier president. The one problem, though, is that he's not really high enough. Is that he's not really a president that had enough time to truly shine, but he did incredible things within his time, though, and could have easily been one of the best presidents if he didn't face the assassination. So with him, he was famous for having he was another one of so with this one, he was one of the anti-cronyist Republicans, and was pretty swag. He was a pretty great war veteran of the Civil War for the Union, and he won by a margin of only 10,000 popular votes, though, and he fought against cronyism in the office, so he's a very committed fighter for justice, which made him pretty great. And he had also, in the end, he had also really fought a lot of elitism. So I liked Garfield a lot. And if we had some more, if he was in office for a lot more, I think we could have had some phenomenal changes in America. Here we have one who definitely ends on a much worse light with President Chester Arthur. And he didn't even get into the office through any legitimate means. He just got into the office because of the fact that he was a president. He only got into the office, though, because of the assassination. And I mean, that's not necessarily inherently awful, but it shows that he wasn't that popular. And most of his presidency was mediocre, so why may I be putting him in D tier? You've got one giant behemoth of a blemish on his career. And that, my friends, is the Chinese Exclusion Act, an extremely racist piece of legislation that probably does not need much of an introduction for you history buffs, if no introduction, probably just for a small amount of my viewers. So this act over here is very self-explanatory, as it had banned Chinese immigrants from immigrating to the U.S. under various restrictions, and obviously it doesn't take much more than a couple of brain cells to realize that that's pretty devious and racist. So easy reason to put him in D tier for being mostly unremarkable, apart from having a despicably racist bill. Now, you have someone who I might want who isn't one that people talk about a lot, apart from his first term, but I don't think he was half bad. I gotta give this one over here to President Grover Cleveland, who I would say is a little bit underrated. There's some things I really like about him, given the fact that he was the first Democrat elected since the Civil War. I do feel like he was a little bit too lenient towards the South, though. However, and of course, in his personal life, while there are several instances where he did fight for justice, though, there were several personal scandals, though, that are pretty terrible, involving various affairs. However, I will say though that in the office, he wasn't half bad. He The best part about it was that he was very anti-interventionist. He hated imperialism, and any president who hates imperialism like that, easy. That over there kind of just gives them the coup up to. That just gives them the gosh darn Pinochet coup up to higher rankings. So I appreciate some anti-interventionism and even more so anti-imperialism that President Cleveland ushered in. And he was a little too soft on I think that there are certain parts of the there are certain economic policies I was a little too soft on, but to be fair, though, I'd say that this also had some of his best accomplishments. He did actually pass he passed that railroad bill that he did prevent the railroad companies from stealing native land and from stealing land from other American citizens. So that over there is in general a very massive accomplishment that he had prevented 81,000 acres of land from being stolen by monopolies. If that ain't pretty anti-monopolistic, I don't know what is. That's pretty godly there. Grover Cleveland, I do appreciate his anti-cronyist and anti-imperialist stances, though. So I think he did have well, he was maybe a little bit moderate for my taste. Not that I'm completely against moderates, but I feel like there were a lot of injustices to be tackled at the time. But apart from certain semblances, though, a lot of the actions he did complete were really nice. Now, Benjamin Harrison, though, I don't know if I want to put him in D tier or F tier, because you do have the fact that he wasn't really that he did have certain stances that were against the racism of African Americans, even appointing Frederick Douglass to office. But President Harrison, though, phew, yikes. I mean, what he did to the Native Americans was truly disgusting. And he genuinely supported the fact that there was a literal he was a genuine supporter of the massacring of Native Americans and that set infamous attack though. See. So this one over here with the clash at the Sioux Wounded Knee over here, this was a massacre of 146 Sioux peoples, many of which were women and children, that he had given medals to the people responsible for the massacre. And on top of that, he was also a horrible interventionist and had supported and was a staunch supporter of the annexation of Hawaii, which ruined the lives of the native Hawaiians forever. And next over here we got this one's probably a big surprise for a lot of people, but maybe from watching this video this may surprise you a little bit less, but I'm putting President McKinley F tier, definite F tier. Why, you may ask? Well, plenty of people praise him for being the one to build the American powerhouse, though, but at what cost? You got the Spanish-American Civil War. You got the Philippine-American War, his biggest mistake, and and the support for the annexation of Hawaii. So you've got the awful elements of the whole American empire trope that was followed by so many so many of the politicians of the time, and by George, is it truly wretched what he had done. All the atrocities that were committed against the Filipinos were truly disgusting. And then you've got the fact that he participated and sent all these troops out to all these different foreign countries, although to fight in wars that America had no point in being in is truly disgraceful. So, you have it. Ironically, though, Teddy Roosevelt is one of those people who it's hard to really find information that can't be said about. I mean, he's an easy A tier, which may sound surprising, though, because his worst element is the fact that he was a rampant interventionist and supported all these banana republics, similar to what presidents like Harrison and McKinley did, that truly did usher in the era of American imperialism from the late 19th century and early 20th century. However, there's of course the legendary elements of Mr. Roosevelt, which are of course his godly, and I mean godly, epicness by passing those antitrust bills. You got some of the best legislation of all time, like the Sherman antitrust one, which had prevented all of those. And this over here had in the Sherman antitrust, might I mind you, did a great job at preventing all these monopolies. It prevented Standard Oil from being a complete domineering corporation, and it made sure that all of these other companies were split into different entities, and that we couldn't have these giant monopolies anymore. And he had also advocated to have better wages, better working requirements, and that whole sort. But but on top of that, though, for President Roosevelt, you've also got his work as an ardent environmentalist by establishing the national parks and making all of these up. And in the end, this did so much for America's beauty. He truly helped preserve America from being able to just endlessly log out the entirety of these forests. He did massive favors again his favors for the environment by preventing an unsustainable logging maneuver were truly phenomenal, and you got to give him some credit in those regards. Now, we have President Taft, though, who wasn't really that remarkable or that impressive, and it's ironic because he's a massive perfectionist. He didn't do terrible, but I think that he just displayed some of the negative elements of moderate politics, though, as President Roosevelt was able to usher in all these positive changes by tackling all these corporations, by saving the environment, preventing excessive logging and excessive monopolies, and overall doing so with incredible charisma and with his great speech taking capabilities and his status as a masculine hero. But President Taft, though, it's ironic that he's really just succumbed to the reputation of being the fat president, which isn't particularly untrue as he was the fattest. However, the story about him being stuck in the bathtub was actually untrue, as it's merely just a story to prove a point, similar to the Washington cherry tree one. And the reason for his significant weight was during the office he had significant stress during those days, and as a coping mechanism he turned to overeating, which made him a lot fatter. Thankfully, though, while he wasn't really a great president or even one that was particularly likable at the time, he thankfully was able to get his foot in the Supreme Court, which back in 1920, this was what made him the first and now only president to have served both in office and in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was a much better fit for President Taft because he had good legislation. He was a lot happier though, and fundamentally, it just made a lot. It was just a positive change for his life, and he was able to lose some of the weight though because he wasn't as stressed out. Next, it's one I had a very hard time deciding whether he should be in D or F tier, but I got to give him very low D tier. And I want to put Wilson in F tier super badly, but we're still judging more so based on politics rather than presidency. And by George, was Wilson very overrated. I mean, he was easily one of the most racist presidents by far, and some would say that it's just an example of him being a product of his times. But no, there is no justifying his racism. At the time, he was one of the major voices in the white supremacist world, view uh, as he was a staunch advocate for the Ku Klux Klan and segregation, and not only constantly displayed and constantly praised Birth of a Nation, the KKK's propaganda film, describing it as as history being written with lightning. He even had his own quote in it, and the quote itself was actually cut from the movie. Was actually slightly cut and edited in the movie, though, as a testament to how racist Wilson was. And Wilson, apart from the KKK, though, he also had a lot of anti-immigration stances towards European immigrants, and worst of all, was actually a staunch supporter of the eugenics movement, which obviously which obviously all of this is pretty horrifying to see someone who's this vehemently hateful against against all these people, though. But on top of that, he also sabotaged the First Amendment. One of the worst things a president can do with his with his effort against the criticism of World War II with the Alien Sedition Acts in 1917. And this is ironic because he had marketed himself as being the anti-interventionist president. And I agree with that stance because frankly, if you ask me, World War I was just an imperialist chess game. And his policies led to the did inadvertently lead to the Spanish flu pandemic, which he didn't really do a huge amount to prevent. So this over here could easily get him in D tier, on top of just overall being a very egotistical character with a very strong messiah complex, literally believing he was doing God's work. And on top of that, you've got one other cherry on top by hiring arguably the worst Supreme Court justice with James McReynolds, who, let's face it, was basically just racist. It was basically Ebenezer Scrooge if he was a Klansman. He was a grumpy old man who hated everyone. He hated the Jews, and fact for he hated all non-white people. He walked out of the court if he had to listen to the opinions of non-whites and women as well. And in fact, with the nomination of Justice Benjamin Cardozo, who was Jewish, he believed that the Supreme Court was basically just giving positions of power to as many criminals and as many degenerates as possible. But we're not here to talk about Supreme Court justices. So you may be asking, with some of the worst and high-spreading injustices committed by any president, including none other than the enormous interventionism as well, that was a massive and rampant criticism of all these other presidents, why may he be in D tier? Well, as much as I hate to say it, there are reasons for the praises of Wilson. They don't really justify him as a president, but there still are legitimate praises. For starters, you got the beginnings with the Federal Reserve, which was morally ambiguous, though, as it did lead room to a lot of banking-based elitism. But it did give a lot of great potential, fantastic potential, in fact, to bring justice for all these presidents. It did bring a more stabilized economy by giving a good level of federal centralization, which I'm not a hardcore pro-federal guy, but having a national banking system is still very important. And on top of that, you've got some really good antitrust legislation, such as raising up the age for employment. So then you could prevent a lot of child labor, and you've got the creation of the 5-day work week. So that would give various customers the luxury of that would give the workforce the massive luxury of time. And probably as great as and surprising enough, though, despite all his hateful stances, he was actually surprisingly well respected by the Jews. Yep. Woodrow Wilson did actually have a lot of powerful Jewish allies, though, including rabbis, financiers, and even nominated the first Jewish Supreme Court nominee, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who was considered, even by some, as has been considered one of the great justices of his era, a pretty influential one at that. And what you may be wondering, though, is what the big accomplishment is, and it's no secret that it's the 13 points. Granted, some of his idea to establish the League of Nations was obviously a failure, but he did try to prevent a lot of the excessive punishment of Germany, though, for its crimes by stripping them of. So he did oppose the stripping of their military, which was a pretty good policy. Was he out of touch in certain regards to it? Yes, but he did have really smart points about it, and I have to respect that about him, that he didn't want to have a lot of the aftermath, and I think they had some wise vision in those regards. But he's still, in my opinion, one of the worst presidents for all the horrors he had committed. Now, next up, we have a president that more people probably agree is one of the worst, and I might move him up to D tier, though, because he did have some pretty good anti-racist stances, and I love an anti-racist president. I love the anti-racist folks a whole lot, and they committed some of the greatest acts of justice in American history. So maybe just very low. I've got to give him F. No hard feelings, but it's ironic because he's considered by far one of the worst presidents in American history, but he wasn't even hated. He was actually considered one of the best presidents since Lincoln. Yes, you heard me right. He was considered one of the best one of the best modern presidents. And it's really surprising, though, and shows how much one's reputation can fall within a short amount. So, President Harding, though, was obviously notorious outside the was pretty well respected in his era, but later on grew very notorious for all of his scandals, his affairs, including that with his secretary Nan Britton, which had produced an illegitimate child, and for just being a generally lazy and thoughtless president. And he wasn't a particularly smart president either, as evident from his return to normalcy speech, which the return to which he had described this, which this left him in a landslide because President Harding was considered a lot more of a stable and much more normal president than Wilson, who was an extremely rampant and aggressive leader. And President Harding, though, was a more relaxed, nonchalant character. But but the big thing, though, is that he was still a blatant cronyist, as evident from the Teapot Dome scandal, his biggest crime in office, which he was giving all those bribes to the oil companies, truly cementing his status as a blatant cronyist and a blatant elitist as well. So, for being both a lazy cronyist and elitist president, I gotta give him to the FT. Calvin Coolidge, on the other hand, I'll admit, I actually really like the guy. And this may come as a shocker, though, because I'm not the most particularly conservative character, but President Coolidge, though, I genuinely thought he had some great policies. So, Coolidge, while I don't agree with a lot of his economic stances as a fiscal and borderline laissez faire capitalist, well, not quite laissez-faire, but he still definitely believed in a very relaxed form of capitalism. He did have some pretty good stances outside, as he was a big supporter of women's rights, which I forgot to mention with Wilson, though, that even if he was reluctant to pass the bill, he did pass the grant women the right to vote in 1920. So that is a massive accomplishment, which some people debate was influenced by his wife, Edith Wilson, who is often considered the first female president illegitimately, as she took over for a lot of his policy after Wilson's stroke in 1919. But Coolidge too was also a supporter of women's right. Coolidge too was a supporter of women's right to vote, which obvious. I mean, you got a massive surge for democracy, similar to some of the best since Abraham Lincoln, since the 15th Amendment, though, granting the right to vote for African Americans. And it's really sad that it took so long for women to get this right to vote, but that's the way things were. And probably Coolidge's greatest accomplishment would have to be the passing of the Native American Citizenship Act, which did allow the right to naturalize citizenship opportunities for Native American citizens, though. And on top of that, despite being very economically conservative, President Coolidge was actually an anti-cronyist character, and even better was that he was still another one of those anti-interventionist characters, which that's definitely a massive favorite, massive props up. Well, you got someone who's a lot more relaxed with their foreign policy, and fundamentally, I really like. Fundamentally, though, he was a really good person. You still got the rumors with Silent Cow's story about the dinner table, just to prove a point about him being wholesome. But he was a genuinely wholesome guy, and if we were ranking him from as a person, that would be A tier. But I have to give him B tier though, because while he was popular with the American people, he was far too relaxed with his economic policy, and that therefore did end up preventing a lot did end up with a lack of prevention for the Great Depression, so many could blame Coolidge with the causing of the Great Depression. Alrighty now, we got the final one for this video before I wrap it up, and that is President Herbert Hoover. And unsurprisingly, he's a D tier president. Many may rank him an F tier, but others do rank him a D tier. And I do absolutely appreciate his humanitarian efforts. And especially as someone with Belgian family, though, he was a massive hero in Belgium for his humanitarian efforts by delivering the food rations to the people of Belgium and just various other European nations. However, economically, though, just as a president, you can't say he wasn't trying, but by George was his handling of the Depression abysmal. Many people do place him in the status as being an American Nero, but he definitely was trying. I think that there are certain things they did really well, though. You got the fact that he was trying. He did try. I mean, the Hoovervilles still were pretty terrible, though, but they tried, though, and even more so, I will say, I do really like what he was able to do. What I really like, I'd say his biggest accomplishments were through the employment of the Hoover Dam to create a massive American project for both American for the American workforce, and it ended up creating a man-made marvel with that. But policy-wise, while he didn't cause the Great Depression, he was still a very incompetent leader during that time, as he was mainly a charity man and did not know a lot about did not really know as much about rerouting the American economy, and a lot of his economic conservatism did have a lot of prolonging of the Depression, as he didn't want a lot of social welfare policies, and most of his policies were actually driven out of taxes. So many of them weren't really ones that are really all around, though, like with universal health care, where one pays taxes to receive the health care. This was receiving taxes for American labor rather than through American benefits, and that was a fundamental and that over there was a fundamentally unsustainable and disastrous choice. And you got his worst decision with the Hawley Tariff Act, which had significantly prolonged the Depression when it had been passed in 1930. But probably but I will say one good note for President Hoover, while he was still a very incompetent president, he did actually he actually did appoint the first vice president of color, which most people think is Kamala Harris, but from Joe Biden, but that would actually be Charles Curtis, who was who was the first Native American vice president and the only one as of now in 2024. And granted, he wasn't a great he wasn't a great vice president, though, but it was still pretty noble of him to have committed such a choice, though, to have appointed him, as it did lead to I think was not the was actually pretty noble of him, but in the end, nothing really worked for Hoover, and fundamentally, he should have relied more on social welfare, and that's where he really failed by just picking charity over more deeply ingrained welfare and reliance and certain policies of the government. But anyways, farewell, viewers of the Macho Man Real Estate YouTube channel, and have a swell day.